Hey everybody! Guess who's back in the house? Hey, it's Romania Black, and we are reading Scum Villain's Self-Saving System, and I think I've worked out the kinks now after week 2, and I am so ready to dive further into this. We started out, I meant to only read 2 chapters, and it ended up being 4. And then last week we had plenty to talk about with 2 chapters alone, but we are treading new waters. We've gotten into the story. We've made it to the first mission. We need to finish that first mission since we abruptly ended it like mid-moment. And we're going to be reading chapters 7 through 9, or pages 53 through 75 on the digital version that I have, pages 71 to 98 in this version. So we're going to get a nice little chunk out today, which is pretty exciting. But I've got some comments I want to talk about before we dive into this and get fully started. But as we left off, we only have 15 B points left, which is not a lot. If we run out, we're dead. So Shen better figure out what he's going to do, right? Reiki, though, had gotten the chapter titles for chapters 5 and chapter 6, which I'll probably each new week update with all of the chapter titles that I have. But chapter 5 last week was called Beginner Rank Mission, and chapter 6 this week was Unfavorable Beginning, which pretty much summed it up very well, right? Sarah Linda talked about in her comment for part 1 the idea of, and I hadn't really thought about it this way, but yeah, Shen Yan in real life, before his tragic bun-related death, is in fact a trust fund baby, essentially, and has just a normal family. I think it's important to note that Shen has a kind personality. We talked about it last week, but not really any ambition, which is so interesting because what we know from the donghua is that as he's going through and looking at Shen Qingche's character, he's like, wow, he really has this ambition, but what is he doing with it? And why is he like messing things up? And why is he doing this when he could be doing that? And it's kind of like him sort of discovering his own sense of ambition, which is really cool, in correcting the errors that Airplane in the Sky has made with Shen in the novel. So I think that's really interesting to note, right? And as Sarah Linda points out, his real personality is already affecting the storyline before we even get to this first mission, which is pretty cool. Now, I think it's important to note, as Sarah Linda points out, that Shen thinks that the original story has a solid foundation. He just doesn't like all the egregious fan service and all the ways that it's deviated in ways that he didn't expect it to and that were a letdown to him throughout the novel. The author gave into fan service and gave away the story's integrity. So I think that that's pretty interesting. It almost seems like MXTX is making a critique of other people's works without, doing any direct digs at anybody. And we'll talk about that here in a second. But it seems like that. And then, of course, there's no complaints over the main character. Now, Sarah Linda called him a Gary Stew in the comment. I don't like the term, and here I'm going to explain this. The term Gary Stew and Mary Stew, my brother and I had a big argument about this like a few weeks ago, of all things for siblings to have arguments with. We were talking about a character in a movie and he's like, oh, she's a Mary Sue. And I was like, now hold on. And I'm not really a big fan of the Mary Sue, Gary Stew kind of trope, because I think that it's just another word for a poorly written main character. And I don't think that Luo is a poorly written character. And I don't know if I would describe him as, to me, a Gary Stew is a character that has never had anything bad happen to them, and nothing ever bad does happen to them. They just skate through the story, and they have no real obstacles, they have no real hurdles, they have no real, and I would consider hurdles to be both physical and emotional. I think so far in the donghua, Luo has had some pretty emotional hurdles to get through, and he was literally beaten by Shen before when the story was starting. So maybe Shen makes him into a Gary Stew by not doing anything to him and letting the plot, just completely wash over him. But I don't know if I would describe him as that, so I might respectfully disagree with that title for Luo, but we'll see how the novel treats it as we move forward. Now, SQQLBH314 had another a big comment with lots of information, so I want to touch on that before we start. In relation, like I said, to MXTX possibly poking fun and maybe referencing authors in their previous works. The whole thing about Zongdian literature, SQQ says it is actually referring to a real Chinese web novel site. I'm assuming kind of like fanfiction.net or AO3. I'm assuming it's similar. Called Qi Dian literature. Qi Dian meaning beginning, and Zongdian means terminal. So it's like directly parroting and making fun of it, right? Which is hilarious. It was founded in 2002, so it's like 22 years old, which is crazy. And most of the stories on that site are the male stallion fantasy genre. So yeah, that directly feels like MXTX is calling them out and making fun of them directly without directly shading any particular author or story. So pretty clever way to do it. Yan in Shen Yan's name means walls or to form a wall. And that's such a perfect character name for Shen, because in the real world it seems like he was just skating through life. He was just this privileged kid that didn't really have to want for anything, but he's put up all these walls over who the real himself is. And now that he's in the story, these walls are going to slowly come down. And I think that part of those walls are going to be related to his sexuality, but we'll wait and see if those walls are torn down by the end of this story, right? And then finally, SQQLBH, I was like, so basically the donghua has Shen in a pickle jar, and the novel has him with his arms and limbs removed. Is one more accurate than the other? And SQQ says that basically it was actually a practice over 2,000 years ago that originally supposedly originated where the husband of a concubine, the wife had the concubine out of jealousy, her limbs cut off, blinded her, put copper in her ears to make her deaf, as well as cut out her tongue and left her in a toilet so she could die as a literal quote-unquote human swine. And that's the idea of turning into an actual stick, which is terrifying. That is so horrifying a fate, right? And then later on, there was another dynasty that had a consort do the same thing to her opponents, but instead of a toilet, and instead put them into wine jars. And it was a process called drunken bones. So yeah, basically censorship in the donghua. They didn't want to show a person with their arms and legs and tongue cut out, even though Shen in the flashbacks doesn't say anything. And as SQQ points out, it's a lot easier to animate a pickle jar than it is a torso with no arms and legs, or to put them in a wine jar. So that all makes sense now. But yeah, someone in the comments for episode 10 of the donghua on YouTube, and I'm recording this a tiny bit ahead, but they were commenting being like, have you seen the monstrosity that's happening on Twitter? And I was like, oh, just wait till you get to week 2. Last week's novel reaction, I'm like, I've got you covered. We're great. I have not caught up, though, with the Twitter. I tried not to get on Twitter and look up anything related to Scum Villain, because I know there will be comments that will instantly spoil me if I pop it up. So I try to avoid it and stay away from it, but I don't know how that realm's going. I don't know if we've moved on from the weird naked Shen things. I have no clue. Who knows? What I do know is we are going to start chapters 7 through 9, which I'm super excited about. We're down to 15 B points. And last we checked, Shen has discovered that he's been captured by the mini boss and he's naked. So we're just going to see how that goes. We're just going to see how that goes for our boy Shen and move on from there. And I've updated Conspiracy Board Sama. I've put a picture of it last week up on Discord. So we'll just go from there and bring Whiteboard Kun out when we're done. But I'm going to try to just read through the chapters and then we'll do our commentary afterwards as per usual. So yay. I'm so excited, y'all. I hope you all are as well, but we've talked long enough. It's almost been 10 minutes. We're going to start chapters 7 through 9 of Scum Villain's self-saving system. And we're going to do that here in 3, 2, 1. And let's do this. Chapter 7. Only his upper half had been stripped naked, but that was already horrifying enough. Regardless of everything else, Shen Qingche was still a peak lord. This appearance, with his upper half stark naked, his lower half wearing only a pair of pants and white shoes, and his forelimbs bound tightly with a thin rope as he lay sprawled on the floor. What was this? So he is at least shirtless, topless in this version, rather than the donghua. He looked exactly like a tender pretty boy caught in bed during an illicit act. No wonder the system had deducted 50 points straight off the bat. It was deserved. Even taking him to 0 would have served him right. I'm like, it's not his fault that this female demon has stripped him, shirtless, but Shen Qingche's face went from red to white and back. He wanted to dig a hole in the ground with his sword and bury himself for a while, but his sword had disappeared without a trace. Of course, Luo Binghe looked both worried and a little embarrassed. He definitely assumed that having seen Shen in such a sorry state, he would inevitably suffer more vicious retaliation once they got back. I mean, is that really what Luo is thinking? I feel that's interesting that that's what Shen thinks he's thinking, but... Shizun, you finally woke up, Ning sobbed. Ying is so scared. Scared? If you're scared, then don't go running off whenever you feel like it, young lady. Shen gave up. At this time, an unsettling chuckle came from behind him. A tall, dark silhouette emerged from the pitch blackness. The great Kangzhong Mountain? The peak lord of Qijing Peak? This is all you amount to? If the so-called greatest sect in the world is full of your sort, the day the demon race conquers the human realm is just around the corner. This was followed by another bout of crazed laughter. The speaker's head and face were covered with a black veil, and their voice was hoarse and unpleasant, as if their throat had been ruined by opium smoke. Shen Qingche squinted. The Skinner demon. That's right. I'm like, how do you speak with like it's going to tear out my throat. That's me. I'm the Skinner demon. How wonderful that the illustrious Zhuya sword has fallen into my hands today. Shen Qingche, Shen Qingche. Even if you think your wits give out, you won't be able to guess my identity. Well, why wouldn't I be able to guess? Asked Shen. The Skinner demon said nothing. You're Daer, aren't you? The Skinner demon said nothing again as they lifted their veil, and she snapped in irritation. Impossible, how did you guess? Shen Qingche was speechless. Did she think he was blind? Bitch, are you for real? That he couldn't tell from her figure? Men loved to look at bodies first before the face, okay? With that curvy bust and bottom, plus that tiny waist in between, she could only be a woman. Also, the room's furnishings smelled rich, and you couldn't just find that anywhere. Of course he knew they'd been transported back to Qin Manor. And while Qin Manor had many women in residence, he'd only seen a couple and had only been introduced to Daer, so if he had to guess, of course he could only guess Daer. He didn't know anyone else's names. How could he guess them? Oh my god. But who knew you'd lose your cool so quickly, without denying even it a little, and jump right off to lifting your veil? Could he say this? Could he? Listen, how could he say this out loud? He could only swallow it down. Daer, or, to be clear, the Skinner demon, quickly adjusted her posture and dawned to the face of old Master Qin's beloved concubine, thus recovering that infinitely tender, stunning, and delighted smile. Not bad, it was indeed me. But Shen Qingche, even if you guessed until your wits gave out, you couldn't possibly imagine why a weak and delicate woman like me would be the culprit, right? Shen Qingche straightened, struggling to assume a posture that was more natural, less rule-violating. Bosses traditionally received time to monologue. How could he not offer this courtesy? Daer didn't need his encouragement and continued unprompted. The Skinner demon comes and goes without a trace, not because I can fly through the skies or disappear into the earth, but rather because every time I finish killing a person, I change into their skin. By wearing these women's skins and imitating their behavior, I can blend into the crowd and with none the wiser in search for my next target. Well, that's not right, said Shen. Daer's expression darkened. What's not right? Well, suppose every time you kill a person and change skins. For example, when you killed Daer and wore her skin, you became Daer. But Daer's skinned corpse would still be there. Wouldn't someone find it strange that there are two Daers? Although, if he thought about it for a moment, he understood. It wasn't like this world had DNA identification. After skinning someone, all he had left was a messy lump of bloody flesh. Pretty difficult to tell exactly who it had been. Looks like you figured that out too, said Daer. Not bad. I used the current woman's corpse to substitute for the last woman's. For example, when I killed Daer, I was wearing Zhang Er's skin, so everyone at the time thought Zhang Er was still alive. After I donned Daer's skin, I disguised Daer's corpse to look like Zhang Er's before it was found. The villain's professional integrity was really impressive. Not only had she exposed her inner thoughts and feelings, she'd also explained her methods and the line of criminal reasoning in detail, offering examples, providing personal experiences. Dyer was more diligently thorough than a college entrance exam cram school teacher. Luo Binghe had been slightly and silently listening the entire time, his eyes glittering with a trace of anger. His juvenile sense of justice had been stirred by this perverse demon's cruel actions. Meanwhile, Ning Yingying's head was spinning from all the zhangs and dais. She couldn't understand it at all, and she didn't dare interrupt. After a certain amount of time, you always change skins. Is this all whim, or do you have to? Asked Shen. Dyer sneered. You think I'd tell you? You've already told me plenty, all right, sis? Or is it, bro? What's one more? What a very considerate person Shen is to want to know what he should address Dyer, the Skinner demon, as. Dyer walked toward where Ning Yingying and Luo Binghe were bound together. Luo remained calm, but Ning screamed, Demon, don't come near! Shizoon, save me! Dyer chuckled, Your master has been bound with my immortal binding cable. Spiritual energy can no longer flow anywhere in his body. He can't hope to protect himself. How can he save you? Oh, that explained it. Shen had been secretly attempting to gather spiritual power, but it seemed to be obstructed. It didn't feel nearly as plentiful as it usually did. Dyer rearranged her monologue mode. Damn, if it weren't for my damaged martial aspect, I wouldn't need constantly to change skin and absorb human chi. You're a brat, but your skin is lustrous and tender, and you're a disciple from a prestigious sect. I expect I'll be able to use you for a good long while. After I suck your skin dry, it'll be your master's turn. That way I'll make sure the Zhuya sword didn't live his life in vain. Luo Binghe stared, silent. Shen Qingzhou stared, also silent. What was that she'd said? You'd think I'd tell you, right? Not only have you told me, you also seem to have made the astonishing decision to reveal your plan. The professional standards of this world's villains are beyond salvation. So, Shen Qingzhou said in his mind as he shamelessly called out to the system, if I make a mistake during a quest and I end up dead, will I get a chance to reload and try again? Only the protagonist is granted the privilege of plot armor, said the system. Great. Good thing this villain had the illustrious quality of must answer every question. If Shen Qingzhou wanted to stall for time, he needed to only toss another question at Dyer. Haven't you only targeted young, beautiful girls? He asked. I never said I only pick young, beautiful women. As long as they're good looking and their skin is fine and smooth, I'll talk to anyone. It's just that most of the time, a man's skin isn't as good as a woman's. And the skin of the elderly is never as good as that of the youthful. As expected, Dyer chattered on and on. Then suddenly, her eyes flashed green with envy, and her expression grew yearning as she began to run her hands, painted with scarlet nail dye, over Shen Qingzhou's upper body. However, cultivators really are different. Even though you're a man, your skin is so glossy and smooth. It's been so long since I had a male's skin. As he was felt up by those searching hands, Shen Qingzhou broke out in goosebumps. Though he strove to give off the air of so spotless and untouchable, part of him was disgusted, but another part was sympathetic. Honestly, this demon was quite pitiful. It sounded like Dyer had originally been a man, but they had to keep using the skin of women due to their condition. After such a long time, of course, that would make you a little twisted. Interesting. Okay. In any case, right in this moment, the demon was wearing the infinitely lovely face of a concubine. Being felt up all over by those lovely hands, Shen Qingzhou inevitably became embarrassed, and he involuntarily shrank back a little bit. This vision, that moment, struck Luo Binghe to his core. Until now, we're switching perspectives. Until now, he'd only ever seen Shen Qingzhou's aloof and remote attitude, his derisive expression. But here and now, a faint, uncontrollable red flush formed on that face, and the way those eyes darted away. Also, Shen Qingzhou's upper body was completely bare, but for the thin yet unbreakable mortal binding cable and the red marks it left. And for Shen Qingzhou's long, disheveled, jet black hair, neither of which concealed anything. Luo Binghe's chest was burning with a convoluted emotion that was impossible to describe. Oh, I think I know what we're feeling. You don't have to describe it, as impossible as it may be. I think we're getting the drift. If you had let Shen Qingge think up an analogy for this emotion, he would have said that it was like watching a beautiful romance movie, only to discover at the end that the protagonist was that English teacher who'd always picked on you to answer questions, and who, if you failed to answer, would give your palm 300 lashes. In short, it both shattered Luo Binghe's worldview and did him great injury. Shen suddenly grinned. "Why are you smiling?" Dyer asked warily. "I'm amused at you and your poor judgment." Shen Qingge's slow and deliberate. "Pearls before swines, as they say. There are 3 options here, yet out of them you keep overlooking the most suitable vessel." At those words, Luo Binghe's face went pale. He could never have imagined he'd randomly be thrown to the wolves. However, Shen Qingge wasn't speaking thoughtlessly. Remember who Luo Binghe was. In truth, he was descended from a line of ancient heavenly demons. Legend has it, that these denizens of the heaven had fallen to depravity and become demons, so they were called heavenly demons for short. As the future princes of demonkind, their bloodline was first class. If an ordinary demon got their hands on such a body, forget repairing a damaged martial aspect, would there be anything they couldn't do? Dyer looked Luo Binghe up and down. The latter strove to appear calm, but inside he was panicking and didn't know what to do, even though he thought until his wits gave out he couldn't figure out why he had suddenly become the star of the standoff. "If you want to trick me, you need a better lie," said Dyer. "This brat's appearance and aptitude may be exemplary, and his skin fresh and tender, but how can he compare to you? You've reached the stage of mid-core formation." "With your level of insight, it's no wonder your martial training was unsuccessful," said Shen, smiling. "Think about it for a moment. What kind of person am I, Shen Qingge? If this child possessed excellent aptitude and a fine appearance but nothing else, why would I accept him as my disciple? If I only wanted a disciple with excellent aptitude, could I have not picked my talents from those who fight to enter the Kangjiang mountain sect every year? Though naturally my thought process cannot be explained to outsiders." Dyer wavered. "Excellent! This villain's IQ was truly ridiculously low. They were so easy to trick, even though Shen had conjured a hasty explanation riddled with logical holes, they actually seemed to be half believing it." Shen struck while the iron was hot. "If you're suspicious, there's an easy test. Let me share a method by which you can verify my words. Go over there and strike him on the crown of his head, and then you'll know whether I'm lying." Luo Binghe's face turned a ghastly white. Though he was mature for his age, he was still a child. Even most grown men couldn't stoically face their deaths, let alone a boy who was only 14 years old. Shen tried very hard not to look at him, and he desperately apologized in his heart over and over again. "Binghe, Binghe, you're a man of virtue. Please magnanimously forgive my smack-talking and backstabbing just this once. I'll never do it again. I'll definitely make up for it in the future." Shizun, you can't be serious." Ning Yingying was scared witless. Shen Qingge was on tetherhooks. It didn't even occur to him to comfort her. He only smiled at Dyer. "You know I'm telling the truth now, but you'll know as soon as you try. Why hesitate? It's only a single strike against an insignificant boy. If I were lying to you, you aren't risking anything, are you? Or are you worried that I'm telling the truth so you dare not hit him?" In the eyes of anyone who didn't know the truth, these were the words of a man eagerly pushing Luo Binghe to his death. Luo stared in disbelief. He wondered bleakly if Shen Qingge's hatred for him had truly become so great. But if that were the case, why had his master just been a little nicer to him on the trip earlier to the city? Luo couldn't help but start struggling with all his might. The ropes restraining his body became tighter and tighter, biting painfully into Ning Yingying, but she didn't dare breathe even loudly and just quietly sobbed. Shen Qingge's words and tones were powerfully persuasive. Dyer thought for a moment and decided at last that, true enough, they had already killed so many people. How could they be afraid to kill one more? They snorted. "I want to see exactly what sort of foolish game you're playing." As they said this, they strode towards Luo to bring their palm down. I like that they're a they now. I like that the gender construct and everything has changed now that we know, right? Chapter 8. It would be over in an instant. Shen's pupils contracted. Right as Dyer's strike came down, by curious coincidence, a ceiling beam broke. If Shen had still been reading The Proud Immortal Demon Way, upon seeing this described, he definitely would have thrown down his cell phone and started screaming curses. The system had already declared it so. The one unbreakable ironclad rule was that the protagonist could not die, meaning that as soon as the protagonist's life was threatened, a death flag would be triggered. Shen Qingge purposefully goaded Daer into attacking Luo in order to take advantage of this rule. He just used someone else to do his dirty work. Admittedly, this was rather unscrupulous, but Luo probably hadn't been in real danger. And if Shen hadn't done this, he would have had to pay the price himself. In the long term, even if he threw Luo under the bus this one time, there'd be more chances to farm his favor in the future. However, to Great Master Airplane shooting towards the sky. What do you think of your reader's IQ? How could a ceiling beam suddenly snap in a perfectly fine, splendid, and beautiful new mansion? Even if it was to let the protagonist escape with his life, this twist was still downright contrived. What's the difference between this and a third-rate melodrama where the male and female leads are just about to marry when they're suddenly hit by a car in a tragic twist ending? Downvote! The practically brand new ceiling beam fell straight down and just happened to coincidentally smack into Daer, smacking them flat to the ground and rendering them unable to get up. The beam also coincidentally smashed into the pillar that Luo and Ning were bound to, causing it to slant. Ning Ying had already fainted from shock, but after some struggle, Luo, his ropes, had further coincidentally loosened. After this string of coincidences, Shen, who was still on the ground and bound by the immortal binding cable, watched as Luo stared, unmoving, at the fallen Daer in a puzzled silence. Was this it? Just as Shen thought that, Daer overturned the ceiling beam and sprang up. Shen Qingge, they snarled enraged. The schemers of Kangzhong Mountain are truly shameless and despicable. What sort of dirty trick did you just use to ambush me from behind like that? Shen was in fact completely innocent. This had nothing to do with him, really. If anything, the chief culprit was Luo. So you really were lying to me, trying to draw my attention away so you could sneak attack me, Daer snapped, unforgiving. Otherwise, why would a perfectly good ceiling beam come crashing down and just happen to smash into me? They also had the wits to notice the parts of the scene that were illogical, so their IQ wasn't beyond saving. Shen was a little relieved. Daer sneered. You thought this would be enough to stop me. Keep dreaming. The immortal binding cable can only be cut by an immortal sword. You can forget about breaking it via any other means. I just praised you and you goof up again. Don't reveal how to free the enemy, dear. Also, did Daer think that no one could see where they'd put Zhu Ya? They even specifically drew back their cloak to show its place in the hip and patted it. Shen could not contain his exasperation, and he took the chance to communicate a little with the system. I need to ask, are all villains in this mold? To guarantee your ability to clear the beginner level quest, activating easy mode set the villain's IQ to below average. Oh, so the easy mode is still in effect. Oh, so not all the bosses would be this easy to fumble through. Shen thought it was a bit of a pity, but he still smashed the like button. Thumbs up, thumbs up. This easy mode of yours is getting a little bit too user-friendly. Daer gritted their teeth. Well, I won't listen to you no matter what you say this time, except your death, Shen Qingge. One last thing, Shen shouted. Sure enough, governed by easy mode, Daer stopped. What last words do you have? Shen thought for a while. How does it feel to sleep with a 60-year-old coot? Daer was struck silent. But they were subsequently so enraged, their expression twisted, their entire body trembling. Luo took the chance to suddenly rush the demon from behind. He snatched Zhu Ya from Daer's hip and drew the sword, filling the entire room with a pure white light. A curved flash of silver and the immortal binding cable on Shen Qingche's body was neatly severed. Once more betrayed by the IQ loss of easy mode, the mini-boss Daer had completely ignored the existence of a living, breathing Luo standing right behind them. Daer cried out in fear, well, this is impossible! Enough! I'm not the listening type! I don't want to hear a rote analysis of a boss's true motives right before their death. The corner of Shen's mouth twitched, and he gathered all his spiritual power in his right hand, lashing out with a palm strike and smacking Daer in the chest. The demon flew back like a kite with a snapped string. This was the first time that Shen had killed someone. But he didn't hold back, not even a little. First, because this was a book. Second, because this was a demon who'd killed countless people. And third, because if he didn't, he'd been the one who would have gotten killed. Shen gazed down at the horrible state of Daer, 4 limbs twisted and broken and bleeding from 7 facial apertures. He turned away. bombarding his own brain with a barrage of his 3 reasons until they blocked out the screen from his mind. Striving to remain calm, he slowly stood and straightened, settled his heart and breathing, fixed his posture, and turned to Luo Binghe. "This was your first time seeing someone eliminate demons and uphold justice," he said. "Were you scared?" Luo's still childish face was slightly pale. "If you wish to uphold, you must eliminate," said Shen, composed. Luo gritted his teeth, his voice quavered. "Shizun, if this disciple may be so bold to ask just now." When the second half of the sentence didn't arrive, Shen spoke. "You want to ask if that ceiling beam hadn't suddenly come crashing down, what was this master's plan?" Shen had no choice but to suffer in silence. He yearned to tell Luo Binghe, "Hey, don't worry! Even if the ceiling beam hadn't collapsed, perhaps the wall would have. Even if the wall hadn't, perhaps the pillar would have. Long story short, you definitely wouldn't have died. The boss definitely would have, and that's all there is to it." But he couldn't speak those words, so he could only adopt an unpredictable air and evade the question by changing the subject. "If you're asking this, are you blaming this master?" Luo shook his head. "No," his expression sincere. "If this disciple could give up his life for Shizun, it would be an honor." Shen was shaken. This kid was too much of a white lotus. "Then this master will promise you in kind," he said after thinking for a moment and settling on properly ambiguous words. "Even if an accident befalls this master, no misfortune will come to you." This was an absolute truth. Even if Shen died 100 times, 100 times, Luo, the protagonist with an impervious plot armor, would go on living in perfect health. "On this matter, I speak nothing but the truth." His voice resounded as he said this, his expression confident and collected, without the slightest hint of falsehood. When Luo heard these words, it was as if his life force had been ignited. The sunflower that had begun to wilt revived, full of renewed vigor. Holding Zhu Ya in both hands, Luo lifted the blade until it was even with his brows and presented it to Shen. "Shizun, your sword." Shen grasped Zhu Ya, taking it from him. Internally, he wiped away his sweat. For now, this child was way too easy to dupe. He'd been thrown under the bus and frightened out of his wits, but a couple of words were all it took to restore him to full health in the blink of an eye. But in the future, he wouldn't be so easy to fool. The path to adulthood truly was tangled with thorns and suffering. Then, a series of system notifications came to him, like a succession of cannon blasts, sending Shen to cloud 9. Ning Ying Ying's favor increased. Protagonist satisfaction plus 50 points. Obtained high-level item. Immortal binding cable. Villain strength plus 30. Completed beginner quest. B points plus 200. OOC feature unfrozen. From this point on, you have full command over the Shen Qingshou's account controls. Congratulations! Please continue to work hard. Shen had fallen a little in love with the sensation of these dramatic ups and downs, the intense joys and sorrows. It was basically gambling. And now the OOC function was unfrozen. From this point on, he could finally carry out the great and glorious task of clinging to the male lead's thighs. Yeah! I'm sure he doesn't realize what that means, but you said it, Shen. You said it. Just saying. Upon returning to Keijiang Mountain, the first thing that Shen Qingshou did was ascend Shangding Peak, which was safeguarded by the sect leader, and report his work to Liu Qingyan. Previously, Shen had thought that Zhang Min Shizhong's existence was basically that of a quest-giving NPC, but as soon as he entered the mountain gates, this impression disappeared without a trace. Shen had yet to enter the main hall when Yu descended upon him, leading a retinue of Changding Peak's disciples to welcome him. They'd just come face to face and smiled at each other and hadn't even yet said anything when Yu's right hand grasped Shen's wrist. Shen was instantly surprised. However, Liu Qingyan made no further movement and instead examined him attentively through his pulse, even inserting a mild spiritual flow of his own to investigate Shen's. He realized that Yu was only inspecting his spiritual circulation, and he relaxed. After a moment, Yu let go. He smiled and walked with Shen to the main hall. "Well, how was the training?" His tone was like that of an eldest brother, which made Shen remember his former self's 2 brothers. He felt a slight sorrow, but greater still was the comforting sense of warmth, to the point that even his dejected report came out cheery. "Unsatisfactory. His disciples hadn't so much as glimpsed the Skinner demon's shadow. Speaking from the angle of disciple training, the trip had been a bust. No need to rush, said Yu. Shen nodded before suddenly changing the topic. Zhengmen Shizhong, I wish to go back to Qiangding Peak and enter secluded cultivation within the Ling Ji caves. Qiangding Peak was the head of the 12 peaks, and naturally it collected the essence of the heavens and earth. As for the living Jing caves, they were Qiangding Peak's best location for cultivating, giving twice the results in half the time. Therefore, the sect's most senior members and outstanding disciples could request permission from the sect leader to enter the caves for secluded cultivation. Only with the sect leader's approval could they act upon this desire. If Shen wanted to enter seclusion in the Lingji caves, he was sure that Yu wouldn't refuse. But the smile on Yu's lips froze a little, his expression changing slightly. Shen sensed something strange, but the strangeness flashed by quickly. For the Immortal Alliance Conference? Yu asked gently. That's correct. It wasn't only because of the Immortal Alliance Conference, though. The incident with the Skinner Demon had made Shen realize the importance of diligent cultivation. In this world, you only had the right to think about the future if you had the strength to meet it. After all, the bosses wouldn't always be on easy mode and saddled with below-average intelligence. Before entering seclusion, Shen called over to Luo and handed him an actual cultivation manual. Why is Shizun giving this disciple a completely different manual? Liu asked as he received it. Your constitution is a little different, so you can't cultivate properly by following ordinary methods. Shen bullshitted solemnly. He didn't want to personally reveal the truth that Shen had inspired Mingfan to give Luo a fake cultivation manual, even though eventually the truth would be exposed. As he stared after Shen retreating back, Luo held that manual in both hands, his heart profoundly shaken. Shizun had specifically given this manual only to him. Shen glanced back a couple times and saw Luo still standing there dumbstruck. He rubbed the spot between his brows and kept walking. He didn't know what Luo was thinking, but the boy was almost certainly thinking too much. You don't even know! You don't even know! Oh my gosh. Okay, we have one more chapter left, and I'm like, things to talk about. Things to talk about, y'all. Things to talk about. Okay, chapter 9. The Lingji caves were labyrinthian. After traveling down 1,000 twists and turns, Shen emerged in what seemed like a different world, strange and beautiful. Here there was neither wind nor moon, yet it was cool and quiet. Together, white stones like clouds and green stones like jade created wonders large and small, as well as natural stone beds. At the center lay a pool of clear water that reflected like this other world like a mirror. The only thing that marred the beauty was that some cultivator who'd previously gone to seclusion here hadn't properly cherished this public facility. The cave walls were covered in countless gashes and gouges made by both blade and sword glares. The stone walls were further plastered with swaths of dry blood, and the stains had already blackened. Oh my god! This was only one cavern of many, and it looked a tad like a murder scene. Shen was very satisfied and had no plans to find another location. He sat on the stone bed and began to cultivate, carefully following the methods he'd memorized from the manuals. Then, as if the heavens didn't want him to try to honestly farm bee points, not long after he began meditating, he heard a strange sound. Panting. The panting of a person in pain. At the same time, he sensed a burst of nigh rampant spiritual energy. All right. He knew what had happened. The Lingji caves were gigantic. Of course Shen couldn't be the only person who'd asked permission to enter seclusion. Someone else was cultivating here as well, and they had entered a chi deviation, which was currently at a critical juncture. I love when MXTX like makes these sentences one word and for Shen to be like, can I not do this in peace? Because he goes, I only wanted to cultivate in seclusion and farm martial skill points. That's all. Can you not do this? Can you not? Shen's eyes snapped open as he decided to investigate. He followed the sound and the waves of spiritual energy as he navigated the various twists and turns. As he went, the disturbances became larger and larger. At last, he arrived in another cavern. As soon as he entered, he saw a figure clothed in white facing away from him, their long swords stabbed into a rock all the way to the hilt. Sword glares flew in every direction without order or pattern. The smears of blood on the person in white said victim, but their movements said crazed murderer. This person's chi deviation was pretty horrifying. Shen mulled it over. With his half-assed knowledge, if he tried to smooth this person's spiritual circulation, it was hard to say whether he would be more likely to help or accidentally stab another spiritual knife into the person's back. It was then he caught sight of the sword. With its master's spiritual energy out of control, the sword trembled unceasingly, pulling itself free a sliver at a time, all the while emitting an ear-piercing shriek. Silver light ran down the hilt's engraved incantations and the phoenix ornamentation in an unending stream. Shen Qingge needed only a single glance to recognize which sword it was and whose sword it was. Fuck! Of all people! He had to meet that guy? Before, he wanted to help, but now all he wanted to do was flee for his life. It was too late. The person in white swung his head around, having already detected his presence. And here's where the cliffhanger was in the donghua episode. Okay. Oh, in any other state, Shen might have declared, what a beautiful man. But a man could be as beautiful as you wanted, and if he glared at you with crimson eyes and bulging veins, you'd scramble to kneel, okay? Shen fled with a flick of his sleeves, but the man slapped the stone wall and sent rubble flying. The long sword finally broke free of the rock and shot through the air to stop before Shen's eyes, blocking his path. He barely managed to break in time. Had he been running even a little faster, he would have been beheaded. In the next instant, the white-clad man rushed him, his eyes devoid of reason. Shen knew it was too late to run, and he could only steel himself to meet this fight head-on. He drew spiritual energy into his right hand, putting everything into this one blow. He struck the man's chest. If this person really was the man the rumors painted him to be, with enough martial prowess to take on the protagonist's OP abilities, this hit would be damn near useless. Not only damn near useless, Shen might be the one sent flying 10 meters back while coughing up fresh blood or something. However, it wasn't useless. And the one sent flying back a meter while coughing up blood wasn't Shen, but the other guy. Shen raised his right hand while staring at the person he knocked flat. To think he was already this badass without even making an effort to fake it! In truth, while those who entered chi deviations were terrifying when berserk, they were also terribly fragile. With luck, a single strike could be the last straw that broke their back. Expression conflicted, Shen watched the man half kneel in pain, straining to rise up and rip up into his foe, only to collapse back to one knee. At last, Shen sighed and moved closer, placing a hand on the man's back. Let me say this first. Shen Qingge didn't concern himself with whether the man could understand him. He was saying it for himself. If I don't help you now, it'll be too late. I'm not familiar with how this works, though, so if you know... Anyway, I've tried my best, so don't blame me. What does that even mean? That can be taken in so many ways. After who knew how long, Shen felt the man's spiritual circulation gradually even out and return to normal. His worry slowly eased, and he withdrew his palms. All that remained was to pray that this slapdash, desperate attempt to help hadn't impaired the man's cultivation. The man he'd miraculously managed to save remained with his head lowered, still not yet fully conscious. To be honest, Shen had already guessed this person's identity, but the system's notification provided absolute confirmation. Ooh. Congratulations! System notification. The scenario, Liu Qingge's death, has been changed. The villain Shen Qingche's grave digging and hatefulness ratings have decreased. B points, plus 200. Yep, called it! This was the Shishidi from the same sect. He was also a sucker who had been done in by the original Shen Qingche. The master of Baizan Peak of Kangzhong Mountain's 12 peaks, Liu Qingge. He was a character who personified badassery. Ah! The 12 peaks of Kangzhong Mountain each had their own long histories and distinctive characteristics. For example, the head, Chongding Peak, coordinated the big picture and oversaw the entire group. Shen Qingche's Qingjing Peak was the favorite of scholars and young artists. Wanjing Peak, with their perfect environment, had produced legions of master swordsmen since time immemorial. Kujing Peak's name, aesthetic practice, spoke for itself. Even if you whipped Shen Qingge, he still wouldn't want to go. And Shan Zhu Peak, meanwhile, was a drool-worthy heaven. That was because this last peak only accepted female disciples, and historically, their disciples were highly attractive. It was therefore filled to the brim with beautiful girls. There'd been no shortage of lewd fan works written by perverted readers, blossoming in mass like flowers. Of these, a tyrannical Zhan Shu fell in love with me. My days sleeping around Zhan Yu Peak had been particularly outstanding, filled with grade school level writing and erotic scenes with no bottom line. The circulation and impact of these fanfics had been enormous, to the point that their popularity compared to that of the original work. Wow, MXTX! Call it out, girl! Just call it out! But out of all of these peaks, the one youths loved the most, revered the most, and were the wildest about joining was definitely Liu Qingge's Baizan Peak. It was the most warlike of Kangzhong Mountain's branches, as well as the branch with the greatest martial ability. Every single generation's Baizan Peak Lord was a world-class swordsmaster, a victor of countless battles, and undefeated legend. How hot-blooded! How dashing! Male readers always fervently admired strong characters. Even though Liu Qingge never officially debuted on page, he hadn't lacked for fans, and Xinyan had been especially fascinated with him. In his headcanon, Liu had been a sharp and manly man, powerful and magnificent, a war god, right? Shen looked down at that face, as beautiful as a fine woman's, and his dreams shattered and died. The fantasies he'd always held, destroyed. How could the invincible Baizan Peak Lord look like his spiritual antithesis? This was clearly the face of a charming young master who arranged flowers and plucked farewell willow branches. With this appearance, you've totally betrayed the headcanons of your martial prowess fanatics. I can't wait to talk about this in the discussion. This is going to be great. Then again, it made sense. Liu Qingge was the older brother of the #1 true female lead, the peerless beauty Liu Mingyan. Okay. Their names were the same in the donghua, and I was like, are they related? But now they're siblings. Okay. As the protagonist's wife, she absolutely had to be first class from top to bottom. It was just science for her to have such powerful genes. Undefeated in battle, an arrogant disposition, and an attractive face. With Binghe around, a second character in the same mold was unnecessary. No wonder Great Master Airplane had offed him so early. Oh my gosh! Oh! But he's in the story now! Okay, we're going to talk about this. We're going to get through this chapter first. Not even the protagonist. Yet you dare share those qualities? Of course you'd be either exceptional canon father or dead in seconds. It hadn't occurred to Shen in the moment, but as he thought about it now, how might saving this person impact Lo's satisfaction points? Oh. There were few details on Liu, but he played a very important role in highlighting the depths of Shen Qingche's general scumminess. Even though the Liu Shen pair were sect siblings, they didn't get along. This was why Shen had tried to flee at first. Already unable to see eye to eye on a normal day, throwing Liu into a chi deviation was just asking him to chase down and hack Shen to death, or, like the original work, to have Shen sabotage and kill him instead. Though no one knew why their hatred ran so deep, it was a sure fact that the original Shen had been Liu's murderer. The exposure of this incident was one of the inciting incidents that marked the start of Shen's downfall. The specific line they used to condemn Shen went something like, taking advantage of an opening during another's cultivation, he intervened, driving the man to his death. So this very moment was likely when he'd made his move. The original Shen killed the female lead's only family. So of course Luo Binghe took revenge for his wife. Shen's hatefulness quotient was truly extraordinary. While Shen was crouching there worrying over his future, Liu had finished coughing up blood and finally regained consciousness. As soon as he opened his eyes, he saw Shen Qingche sitting before him with a bored expression, looking down his stuck-up nose at him. He definitely didn't look like someone with good intentions. Alarmed, Liu violently jerked upright, ready to defend himself. The motion jarred his badly injured internal organs, throwing his chi circulation into chaos. Another mouthful of blood sprayed out of him. Oh, Shidi, regulate your chi. Don't be so agitated, Shen said coolly. You're the Baizan Peak Lord. How could you let yourself look so wretched? Here, wipe yourself off. He passed Liu a handkerchief. Liu coughed up more blood. Shen, what the hell are you planning now? Seeing how much he was suffering, Shen lightly clapped him on the back. Liu instantly assumed that Shen intended him harm, but was helpless to avoid the touch. Only after the palm connected did he feel a clear, steady stream of spiritual energy flow through his body, smoothing his circulation. Liu was more aghast than he would have been if Shen had stabbed him in the back. After all, he was used to the backstabbing. Shen continued to pack his back. Oh, Liu, shitty. To tell you the truth, lately, Xizhang has been in seclusion and he's come to realize many things, he said earnestly. Seeing you at death's door, a beauty fading, dying so young, it brought back so many memories. Xizhang is deeply ashamed and filled with regret. Liu began to hack up blood even more profusely. From this point on, how about we leave our disagreements behind us and move forward hand in hand as a pair of model sect siblings, full of affection due to fellow sect members? Shen suggested, tactfully expressing his goodwill. How do you feel about this, Shidi? Laying his objective out straight was a little shameful, but since he hadn't killed Liu and thereby changed the scene and avoided its evil karma, he figured why not go all the way and simply build a good relationship? Maybe Master Liu could even back him up in the future. Liu Qingge's complexion was abnormally poor. He looked Shen in the eyes for a while. Then, as if he'd finally reached the limits of his tolerance, he said, "You, go away." Shen nodded in understanding. After all, they'd hated each other for so long. You couldn't farm favor points so soon after a heel turn. He couldn't rush this thing, only take it slow. He went as asked, waving behind him without looking back as he walked away. If Shidi runs into more trouble during training, there's no need to be shy. You can call Xizhang for help. Since we're so close, we should take care of each other. Liu looked like he would cough up more blood if Shen said anything further. His glare was terrifying. Shen wisely shut his mouth and did as he'd been told. Liu was left alone, and he painfully hacked up another mouthful of blood. They'd always been at odds. Ever since he was young, Liu had been unable to stand Shen. Both parties had deeply despised one another. It wasn't the type of vitriol that you'd see when a belligerent but happy couple fought and argued, but the type where one wrong word would escalate into violence, even to the point of trying to kill each other. The fact that Shen Qingge hadn't kicked him while he was down was inconceivable in itself, but to go so far as to help even save him? But the reality was right before him. Liu's face couldn't help but twisting. He was unable to remember what had happened after the moment he lost control. But now his spiritual circulation was smooth. He couldn't have straightened it himself during his frenzy. He must have had outside assistance. Could Shen Qingge really have helped him? Just thinking about the possibility filled Liu with revulsion. He would have rather died. Oh! MXTX has not given us the maximum cliffhangers yet, so we're doing pretty good, but oh, y'all, I'm gonna have to go get Whiteboard Coon and come right back because we should probably talk about this. Well, it is somewhat good news that we've not hit the MXTX cliffhangers yet. Here's the thing. I know the story at this point. I don't know all of it, clearly, because we're getting more information than the donghua let on. So that's exciting. It's not just like a total beat for beat, from the adaptation of the donghua is not a total beat for beat adaptation from the novel, which is good because that would have been boring. We're getting a lot more information, which is like, oh, interesting. But I kind of know what's happening right now. So even though when the chapter's in, like the end of chapter 9, I was like, okay, I know where we're at. It's gonna be hard when we get into uncharted territory, and then I'm gonna be like, oh, but I want to keep reading. I already see it's coming. I just see it down the pipeline, and it's gonna frustrate me. And when we get to that point, I don't know if I'm gonna be able to hold back. I may have to read ahead once we get to that point, because I really, really like this story. I really like the way that MXTX writes Shen, and particularly writes Shen's internal dialogue. I really like it. It's actually a lot more, I wouldn't describe it as first person because it's more third person observer, but it's inside Shen's head, and we get to see his thoughts, and then we get to see Luo's thoughts, and we also get to see the thoughts of others. So I don't know if you've read Harry Potter. I know it's been referenced in this book already, so I feel like I can use it as an example. But Harry Potter is very much done from the same avenue as this. It's the way that Harry Potter's, we follow his way of thinking and his thought process, and that's kind of like what we do here with Shen, right? It's not fully first person because it's not using like I and me, but it's mostly from their perspective, but we do get the perspective of a couple other characters. I would argue this does more than Harry Potter in terms of giving you the perspective of other characters, but whereas Modao Zushi and Heaven Official's Blessing, it's really a third person story. Like, you are a fly on the wall. You're following the main characters around, but you're not really, you're kind of in their heads, but I would say not to this extent. I feel like these last few chapters remind me a little bit more of Heaven Official's Blessing in a way. I guess you are in Shilian's head a bit throughout that process, but I would argue you're more in his head. So I don't know. It's interesting. As we go through the story, it's going to be interesting to compare. But man, so some things that are being pointed out in this chapter set that I hadn't really thought of from the donghua, and now I'm like, oh, okay. So we need to go through this, right? Because some things were given away to us that were not present in the donghua that I'm like, we need to note this. It's going to probably be harder to see because I'm using carrot colors. I'm using green and orange today, but and the green is about out, but I'm going to use it till it's out so we can throw it away. So I'm not wasting nothing here, right? So let's just get into this. So in this novel version, Shen is completely topless. He has a very thin little layer of pants on, but he's not fully naked, but he's more naked than the donghua. And I know for censorship reasons, they can't really draw him like he is in the novel, but he's in a very compromising position. And he's just like, oh, what is this? Why do I look like this? I don't like this at all. And of course, he looks over to Luo, and Luo's like starstruck, and Shen takes it as, of course my little Shijong is embarrassed for me. And I'm like, well, what's interesting is if you've not watched the donghua, then you would probably look at this scene and not really think about how much Luo is really looking at Shen and really having some conflict. You probably wouldn't get that impression, but the donghua does take it a little bit further and does extend those sentiments and that subtext quite a bit. So we do get the confirmation that the easy mode was still in effect. And I was like, oh, awesome. Okay, so that's really hard to see, but bear with me. So the easy mode is still in effect. We'll use a different color next week, so don't worry. Easy mode wasn't just something that got them to the mansion. It's still in effect, and it's the reason why the Skinner demon is so easy to defeat. That makes so much more sense, because when he was like, all the villains at the beginning of the novel, he talks about how all the villains are just really dumb. And the whole point is to raise the IQ of the characters to be able to face them, right? Well, when we had the Skinner demon, I was like, okay, are all the villains going to be kind of dumb like this? And it's just Shen trying to stay in character while battling them. But at that point, I didn't realize that this mission was going to break the OOC function. And I was like, oh, okay. But no, it's just the fact that he had chosen easy mode, and now his enemies are going to be harder as he goes on. That's interesting. That makes it a little bit more intriguing as to whether or not the easy mode is going to be offered anymore. That's something that's going to be, is it going to be on the table in the future? Because at first, when I was watching the donghua, I was like, and he gets knocked out by the mini boss and loses all the B points. I'm like, oh, well, that was a waste. I don't know why you would choose easy mode in the future, but knowing that it lowers the IQ of your opponents at the cost of some badass points, I'm like, if he accrues enough, would it be worth it to use it again? Especially if you're like up against a really important villain. I don't know. Could he use it against Nightmare by the end of the series? I don't know. That would be honestly hilarious if they got to the very end and Shin's like, wait a minute, I have like 3,000 badass points. I'm going to use 100 of them to activate the easy mode. Like, that would be hilarious. And then they'd be like, wait, what? That would be honestly, if Shin use the easy mode this very first mission. We go the entire story not using it, and then it's like our Deus Ex Machina at the end, and Shin's like, I don't want to have to use this, but I'm gonna have to use this. And that's how we win the day. I would honestly, I'd be like, yes, MXTX, I'm all about this. Good job. Way to go. But I don't know if that's going to come out or if this is just like the only time it's used and we're not going to use it again. Because here's the thing about Shen. Shen is, he's a bit proud of how much he knows as being an otaku about these novels. And he's a pretty proud person in a sense that he's kind of offended that the villain's like, how'd you figure out my scheme? And Shen's like, how could you not? Like, it just, Shen's kind of funny in that sense. So I'm wondering if he's just like, you know, with his pride, he's like, I don't want to use the easy way out in the future, even though that'd be convenient. Plus, he needs to save his B points. So there's that too. But I love his tone in this whole series so far. He's so sarcastic, but he can be sarcastic and blunt, but at the same time, he can be really nice and do like the shielding. Like, I relate to Shen. I find that I can be really sarcastic and snippy sometimes, especially if I'm frustrated. But then, like, I like to think that I try to be nice. I like to think that. I think all of us like to think that about ourselves. But it makes Shen very relatable, right? It makes him somebody that's flawed, but very relatable, and we can kind of connect with him as a character, which is really nice because, you know, not to talk too much about Heaven Official's Blessing, but the main character of Heaven Official's Blessing and of Modao Zushi are both flawed characters, but there is like a level to them that feels like kind of above, I feel like, as a reader. And I was like, man, they're so cool and they're so this. Shin feels like somebody like us. Shin feels relatable. He feels down on our level. He's not like a god. He's not like a prodigy. He's just an otaku who has happened to have read a lot of these novels, so he kind of knows the tropes going into it and is able to navigate the system, but he's still not perfect. And I like that about Shen. I like that about his character an awful lot at this point. I also like how all of these coincidences happen in his favor, like him guessing it's Daer. He's like, well, you're the only one I know the name of, so I had to guess it. I didn't have a choice. And then the whole thing with the beam, where it was just coincidence and just plot armor for Lo, and it just happened to work in his favor, which I think is because of the easy mode. I think the easy mode, the demon like called it out, which Lo is like, oh, maybe he didn't mean to throw me under the bus and try to kill me. Maybe he was doing it thinking he trusted me. The donghua, to me, in this scene, the donghua makes it seem much more apparent that Lo believes that Shen was trying to help him and Shen believed in him and wasn't actually trying to hurt him. The Lo in the novel, he seems to think that, but he's not as convinced as I feel like he is in the donghua. So I'm curious if in the novel, and we'll have to get there, obviously. But I'm curious if in the novel we have Lo actually being more persuaded by Nightmare, because Nightmare's like, yeah, Shen was terrible to you. Do you remember that? And I wonder if Lo is going to remember that and it's going to come up and be more of a plot point. We'll see. We'll have to see how that goes. But yeah, so then what's interesting here is that the Skinner demon talks about all the different corpses that they've been going through, and most of them have been the concubines. And I like that Shen calls them a more diligently thorough than a college entrance exam cram school teacher, which is hilarious, right? And Lo, his juvenile sense of justice had been stirred by the perverse demon's cruel action. So of course Lo is like, I've got to do something. And honestly, there's more talking from Lo in the donghua, I feel, whereas this scene is a lot more through Shen's perspective. So that's interesting. But here's the thing. I really like the conversation that Shen has about the Skinner demon and talks about how he asks the system, he's like, okay, if I make a mistake and end up dead, can I reload again and try again? Because he's read other isekai, and he's like, okay, if I die, can I just respawn somewhere else? We get that question answered for us. The answer is no. Only Lo is granted the privilege of plot armor, which is kind of weird. The system doesn't really answer his question of whether he'd reload or respawn anywhere else, but basically says no, only Lo has that ability. So there is no second chance. here's your one chance, fancy, don't let me down. It's basically what the system tells. It starts playing Reba McEntire and tells Shen that he's got this one chance, don't screw it up. And Shen like starts blaring Hamilton in response and is like, I'm not going to throw away my shot. But yeah, this part here where Shen is like, haven't you only targeted young, beautiful girls? And the Skinner demon says, I never said I only pick beautiful women. They just have to be good looking with their skin fine as smooth. But most of the time, a man's skin isn't as good as a woman's, and the skin of the elderly is never good as that of the youthful. And so then it has like the part, and to be fair, it is a little bit creepy because Dyer does like kind of, violate Shen, and Shen's just like, eh. And that's when we're going to talk about that moment here in just a second though. But my point was the conversation is interesting here because Shen points out that he felt sympathy for the Skinner demon because it originally had been a man, but had to keep using the skins of women due to their condition. And after a long time, of course, that would make you a little twisted. And how I took that conversation was kind of talking about like gender identity and the idea that if you're born a certain gender, but that's not your identity, you're forced to be something that you're not, it does mess you up. So to me, I took it as like the Skinner demon is originally, it identifies as male, but it's been forced to adopt this female persona all this time. So of course it's a little bit messed up. And I'm like, interesting. That's an interesting way to like talk about gender identity and the effects of being something that you're not can have on you. And I thought that was really interesting. I was like, okay. But then we have to talk about Luo and the idea of, what was it there? He's like, I'm amused at you and your poor judgment, pearls before the swine. These options are here, yet of them you keep overlooking the most suitable vessel. So Shen points out that Luo was descended from a line of ancient heavenly demons. Now, it is said here that heavenly demons, there is a little bit of differentiating here. Put this on here. So heavenly demons are denizens of heaven who they're basically fallen angels, essentially. They're fallen angels from heaven, and they're the future princes of demonkind. Their bloodlines are first class. So, of course, they have like all these magical properties. They're pretty much like invincible. Makes sense why Luo is the protagonist, why it works out like that. So then he's like, with your level of insight, no wonder your martial training was unsuccessful. So yeah, the villain's IQ is ridiculously low. There was something else I wanted to note here. Yes, it's the moment where Luo is like staring at Shen and his upper body. Yeah, the vision, that moment struck him to his core. Because here, he'd only been used, we need to write this down as one of our key moments here, is Luo seeing a vulnerable Shen. Up until now, he'd only seen him as like this remote and aloof attitude. But now he has this like flesh on him, his eyes darting away, his upper body bare. It was giving Luo some ideas, possibly, and making him feel things. Possibly he was having a sexual awakening right here with Luo and the demon's clutches. That we're gonna put that up on Conspiracy Board Sama. That is a key moment right there. But in any case, I love that Shen's like, please forgive me. Please forgive my backstabbing. I'll definitely make it up to you in the future. And Ning passes out, and that's when the beam comes across and hits the demon. And then, of course, Luo is like struggling why his master been just a little nicer to him before. And honestly, if the demon hadn't come out and basically explained the attack and said that Shen was being deceptive, then I don't know if Luo would have really gotten that and would have thought that his master was actually offering him up and throwing him under the bus. I do like that Shen calls out the author, saying in the long term, even if you threw Luo under the bus, he'd have more chances to farm out favor in his future. But he's like, what do you think of your reader's IQ? How could a ceiling beam suddenly snap in a perfectly fine, splendid, beautiful new mansion? I love that Shen calls out the plot holes with all of this. He's like, this is dumb. Why didn't you think of that? And even the demon calls it out as well. There were several moments in these chapters that it's like MXTX is calling out the bad writers and their tropes. And I'm like, oh, girl, throw that shade. Get all up in here, right? And the coincidence. And so then, as Shen thought, Dyer overturned the ceiling beam and sprang up. And that's when they reveal that he basically says everything that needs to help Shen out of that moment. Mm-hmm. And then the IQ is below average, as in turns with the easy mode. Mm-hmm. So yeah, they end up beating the demon, which is great. End up solving that whole problem. And Shen covers it by being like, well, this is your first time seeing someone eliminate demons and uphold justice. Were you scared? If you wish to uphold, you must eliminate. So Shen, this is the first time Shen's actually killed something. And granted, he does acknowledge it's in a novel. It's not real, but he still is trying to like keep his composure after everything that happens. Now, I think that line, if you wish to uphold, you also have to eliminate, that's gonna come back, right? I feel like they're gonna get, when Luo embraces his demon side, they're gonna have Shen come across that line again, being like, if you uphold all the beliefs that you have, you're gonna have to eliminate Luo. And Shen's like, I don't want to do that. I don't want to turn into a human stick. No, please. So that is going to be interesting to see how that goes down, to see how we handle that, right? And so he's like, if this disciple could give up his life for Shizun, it would be an honor. And Shen says, then I promise you in kind, even if an accident befalls this master, no misfortune will come to you. Careful what we wish for, right? I'm very curious to know if Shen's going to end up, if that's going to be like, I don't know. Shen could die in the final part of this, and maybe that's going to be part of the plot point that Shen actually dies. I don't know. And Luo brings him back, or Shen goes back to the real world, or I don't know. I don't know how that's going to go. That's going to be interesting to see how that ends up working out, right? In any case, he gets his sword and wipes away his sweat, and he's like, man, I like that Shen acknowledges, he's like, yeah, Luo's really easy to dupe right now, but he's going to grow up and that's not going to be a thing anymore. So that's setting something up as well. That is setting up that right now, Luo is really impressionable and Shen can pull the wool over his eyes, but if he tries to do it when he's an adult, it's probably not going to work out. So I'm going to be curious to see like what route that goes. But anyway, so the system notifies us that Ning Ying's favor increased. Protagonist satisfaction is plus 50 points from that. You got the immortal binding cable, which we're going to need to know the immortal binding cable. We're going to put that out to the side on Conspiracy Board Sama as an item that we've gotten, which is plus 30 points. And then you completed your beginner level quest that unlocked the OOC. So we have 200. So our points at this point, we have 5, and then we've got 1. Well, hold on. We have 80, 90, 295 points is where we're at. Awesome. Yay! Go Shen. Get them B points. And so now, that line when he's like, I could finally carry out the great and glorious task of clinging to the male lead's thighs. I was like, oh my God, Shen, do you know what you're saying? I feel like he knows what he's trying to do in trying to impress and satisfy Luo, but only because he thinks that's going to keep him from becoming a human stick. I don't think he realizes that he's actually attracted to him yet at all. Which again is good because Luo is only 14 right now. That'd be kind of awkward. So then he goes back to the mountain, and he meets back up with him, and we have this big conversation about all the different peaks. And he talks about, was training successful? And he's like, no, not really. And he's like, I want to go to the peaks to cultivate. And so there are 12 peaks, and I'm going to grab a different marker for this. We have 12 peaks, which is worth noting. We have the one that they are on, which is Cheongding, which is where you and Shen are, and their place. And I think that they're going to talk about like what each of them, they're like the daughters of Triton. They all have like different aspects about them, right? So the Lingji Cave is where he's going to go to cultivate. And honestly, if we're talking about Heaven Official's Blessing, I'm going to try not to spoil, but there is a scene in Heaven Official's Blessing that involves cultivating in a mountain. And this very scene reminded me a lot of that. And I was like, oh yeah, this seems like this could be derived from where MXTX got that idea for Heaven Official's Blessing. Also, I want to make note that without spoiling much, you have Luo and a character in Heaven Official's Blessing that are both these kids that have gone through hardships, that are infatuated with their partners, who to them are this beacon of light. The thing that's hilarious is that in Heaven Official's Blessing, the heavenly light is actually pretty on the nose, and in here Shen is a total sham. He's just passing himself off as his character that he's not really, right? Interesting. So what's fascinating about this conversation between you and Shen is that you seems to always be on eggshells around Shen. And I don't know if that's just the character in the novel knowing how bad Shen has been in the past, that he's kind of reserved and on edge, but he is. He's like, oh, are you getting ready for the Mortal Alliance Congress or whatever? It's like he's almost afraid to talk about it in front of Shen, which is fascinating to me, right? So I like the idea that Shen also gives Luo the new manual before he goes to cultivate. And what's interesting is that Shen believes that Luo is going to find out about the fake manual. He thinks Luo is going to figure it out eventually. So we need to probably put on here the idea of Luo with the new manual. I'm going to be curious if that's going to come up. If it is going to ever come up that Luo figures out that the manual he started with was fake. Because, you know, Luo gets a new manual and he's like, oh, he gave this manual only specially to me. And Shen looks back at him and he's like, that boy's thinking too much. And I'm like, oh, you have no idea. You have no idea how too much Luo is thinking about. But that's going to be interesting to see if that ends up becoming a thing. And I also like how the novel explains that Shen knows that he needs to grind. He needs to level up. He needs to grind. He needs to go fight some Pokemon in Mount Moon, level that shit up. And he also needs to make sure that Luo can be powerful too. And he's like, well, you might as well be on the same level as me. So here's an actual manual. Have at it. Go have fun. So then we get to chapter 9, right? And we get to the cave. The twists and turns, the thousands of twists and turns in the cave. I really like how they describe the pool that reflects in the middle of it, right? But I like that it starts out, it's like the Bambi clearing where there's like all these birds and chirping birds and everything's so nice. And then he's like, well, there's blood on the wall. Like, it's like this beautiful, serene imagery. And he's like, well, that's what it would look like, except there's all this like messed up stuff around us. That's amazing. I love it. And then he talks about the person panting. And I like that Shen gets so annoyed by the panting person. He's like, I just want to cultivate in peace. Why can't you let me do this? And I love that MXTX has, every time Shen gets frustrated, he says sentences. Every single word has an exclamation point over it. It's great. So yeah. So the person's chi deviation. Now, chi deviation reminds me a lot of Modao Zushi. And I know that that's a trope that's in a lot of Chinese fantasy novels. Modao Zushi and Heaven Official's Blessing are the only two that I've read. So I don't know how common it is, but I know that that's kind of a thing there. So he's like, with his half-assed knowledge, if he tried to smooth the spiritual circulation, it's hard to say if he'd be helping or stabbing another knife into their back. He ends up doing it anyway, so I guess it worked out. But I love also Shen has a potty mouth. It's a very vulgar mouth. He says the F-bomb every now and then, and realizes who it is. But this part here, where he's like, in any other state, Shen might have declared, what a beautiful man! But a man could be as beautiful as he wanted and glare at you with crimson eyes and bulging veins. You'd scramble to kneel, okay? I was like, Shen's like, look, I can call a man beautiful, okay? Doesn't reflect my sexuality at all. So yeah, we find out that it's Liu, the man that he was supposed to kill, but we get some information about this, right? we get some information that Liu and him were like childhood friends in the novel. And I was like, oh, they're sect siblings. They grew up together. They're kind of like Chang and Wei Wuxian. Honestly, they're kind of like that. They're basically like siblings. And they grew up in the sect together, and they were always kind of against one another. And I'm like, oh, okay. Well, now it makes more sense why Liu is freaked out around him. Because he's like, this isn't you. You're not acting like yourself. You've hated me all your life. Why are you helping me now? Right? Interesting. So then the system says you prevented his death. So the scenario has changed. The villain Shen's grave digging and hatefulness ratings have decreased, and you get 200 B points. So by changing the storyline, we're up to 495. Quite the turnaround we've done in 3 chapters. Quite the turnaround. So we saved Liu. We saved from dying. But the circumstances surrounding his death is fascinating to me. So I want to talk about it with y'all. Because we talk about the 12 peaks, right? And Liu is the master of Baisan Peak. Okay? So his character was personified with badassery. All right, so the 12 peaks have their long history. So Shangding Peak is coordinated with the big picture and the overall seeing everything, okay? And that's the one that Yu is in charge of, right? So then we have Shen Qingche's his Qijing Peak. So it's not, that one's Yu. That one's not Shen. It's just the overall ruler over everything. Then we have Qingjing. And I'm going to blame Airplane in the Sky for giving these all very similar names. But Xijing is where Shen is from. And that is tied to scholars and artists. The arts. Makes sense. All right. Then we have Wanjing Peak, which I wonder if that's like Wanrong in them, maybe. So Wanjing is tied to swordsmen. It has a good environment. Then we have Kujing. We have Kujing. And that one is aesthetic practice. So that's the one that Shen doesn't want to go to. It's not aesthetic. I'm not as familiar with that. So I want to look that up real quick and see what is aesthetic. That one is the suggestion, the practice of severe self-discipline or abstination from all forms of indulgence, typically for religious reasons. Oh, well, we gotta stay away from that one. We can't have sex in that one. Shen doesn't want to go to that one. Oh my God, so that one's about abstinence. Okay. That one's about staying sober and no sex, so we're not going there. And then Jianshu Peak is the ones with the ladies. That has all the female cultivators. Okay. Which I'm assuming is where the one cultivator woman comes from in the purple. I'm assuming. It only accepts female disciples. They're all very attractive. And then I freaking love that MXTX kind of goes off and kind of like directly calls out like the fan art and the fanfics that are just basically like just the most smutty, worst writing fics out there that are just taking that concept of the female characters and just being just filth. Like, I'm like, I love that MXTX calls them out. I'm like, that is so freaking good, right? So then of all the peaks, the ones youth loved the most was Baisan Peak. So interestingly enough, Baisan is the most warlike with all the martial arts. Okay. So we only get 6 peaks named. At this point, we don't have the other 6 yet, so that's encouraging. We'll have 6 peaks, and then we'll go back and have the other 6 later on. I'll probably write them and put them on Conspiracy Board Sama at the moment. But what's fascinating is that Liu is like the man in charge of it, and so you would think what's nice is that Liu was a side character that died early on in the story. So he's not talked about. Nobody knows what he looks like. And Shen had just wrote him off as a character that Shen Qingge kills to like get a leg up, and it ends up being part of his downfall. What we don't know is what he actually looks like. So when he sees him, he's like, I thought in my head canon was where you were this big burly man because the sect you're from is this big warlike community, but you're like freaking Griffith from Berserk. You're just like this beautiful, handsome man. And it's like, oh, okay. So I like the idea that Shen is like all of his fantasies have been destroyed. How could the invincible Bison Peak Lord look like his spiritual antithesis? The face of a charming young master who arranged flowers and plucked farewell willow branches. You've betrayed the headcanons of your martial prowess fanatics. And I love that. I love that MXTX makes Liu very handsome and not like what the headcanons had proposed. However, we get two other pieces of information. One is that Liu Mingyan is his sister. And I'm like, she's one of the ones that goes into Luo's harem in the original. So in this, his sister ends up in Luo's harem and gets Luo to seek revenge on Shen for killing him. And that kind of makes sense. But here's the interesting thing. We know that the story is changing. It's changing now. It's been changing since Shen got there. So it would make sense for her to go to Luo's harem because we've established in the story that Luo took on any woman that wanted to come into his harem. Any lady, he was like, come on in, I'll take you on. We'll all be one big happy family. Let's go. But also the fact that she lost, it would make sense in the original story because in the original story, Luo had been oppressed and abused by Shen Qingge. And so, of course, he had it out for him. And so when Mingyan comes there, and Mingyan's like, oh my God, Shen murdered my brother, then Luo would be like, well, join my harem, we'll go after him, we'll kill him together, and we'll get revenge for your brother's death. Makes sense, right? Especially with how awful the original Shen is. But now, not only is Shen not awful like he was, but he's not killed Liu. So the only reason she joined the harem probably to get revenge on her brother is now not a viable reason for her to be in the harem. So she has no reason to ask to be in the harem or to seek out comfort from Luo because she doesn't need to. So the story's been altered again without, and I don't know if Shen realizes that. He's like, but he does say it hadn't occurred to him, but as he thought about it, how might saving this person affect his satisfaction points? And I was like, damn it, Shen! Shen thinks that Luo's not going to be as satisfied because he's going to have one less woman in his harem. And I'm like, oh, Shen, I don't think this is what's going to be affecting the satisfaction points. I think that whole grabbing his thighs is really what's going to be affecting the satisfaction points. But yeah, something else was brought up in this too that I thought was fascinating. And it's that Liu, with Binghe around, a second character in the same mold was unnecessary. So here we have Liu, who is very similar to Luo in that he's badass and strong, has support, and is really handsome. So that's begging the question of now we have Liu over here who's pining after Shen, and we have Shen over here who has saved, or Luo rather, Luo and Liu. The names are similar, I'm sure by design. And we have Liu who is kind of confused, like, why'd you save me? And so I'm curious is Luo going to get jealous of Liu at some point? Is he going to think, is Nightmare going to try to twist this and Nightmare be like, oh, well, Shen saved Liu. He saved him. They have the childhood trope working for him. So Shen and Liu are going to be in a relationship and Luo's going to be like, I can't stand that. So is Luo going to kill him or not? I don't know. But it's just like the moment that MXTX says in here that Liu kind of functioned the same way as Luo, and that's why he was killed off early, because you can't have two badass, handsome characters in the same story. I'm like, so what do we do then? What are we going to do with that? And it's like, I'm like, is Liu going to be used as like a I could see maybe Luo getting jealous of him when there's no reason for him to be jealous because Shen would be oblivious. I could see Shen being oblivious and being like, look at this handsome man. And Liu's like, are you flirting with me? And Luo's like, are you flirting with him? And Shen's like, I don't know what you're talking about. Just, I don't know. That's going to be interesting to see how this goes and what we end up doing with it. But yeah, so the start of Shen's downfall was that murder. The specific line used to condemn Shen was taking advantage of an opening during another's cultivation. He intervened, driving the man to his death. So it's like the original Shen killed the female lead's only family, so of course Luo took revenge for his wife. But here we have Shen saving him, so what is going to be the effect of that? I like that Liu reacts very, like, in the donghua it was kind of funny because you were like, it made sense why Liu was kind of thrown off. He was like, what's going on? What are you doing? Why are you staring at me like that? Here, it makes more sense why Liu is so outraged because he's like, we've known each other since we were kids and you hated me all this time and now you're helping me? What the what? So these scenes later on, when it's just Shen and Liu, are going to be very interesting. They're going to be very interesting indeed. But yeah, so in any case, Liu shies him away. And Shen's like, okay, old buddy, old pal, I'm just gonna mosey on my way. Just don't worry about me. And Shen like just shut his mouth and did what he was told. And Liu's trying to figure out why he didn't kick him while he was down. He's like, he didn't know what happened after he lost control, but now the spiritual circulation was smooth. He had outside assistance. Could it have been that Shen helped him? Just the thinking about this possibility filled him with revulsion. He would have rather died. Kind of like, you've been such an asshole all our lives. I would have rather died than to have accepted help from you. But it's going to be interesting to see how he sees Shen as the story goes on and what he ends up, because he's going to end up helping him after this next battle that we're going to get, I'm assuming, next week. So that's going to be interesting. I like Liu's character a lot in the donghua, so I'm really excited to see how his character is in the novel. But I did want to make note, there is one image that we get for this week. It is not shirtless Shen, as it were, but it's close enough. It actually, the image that we get is good old Shen helping out Liu there. Look at him. Look at that. I love the way that they draw Liu. His face is just like, and Shen, of course, just looks like the little thing. He's like, hey, friend. Hi, handsome man. And Liu's like, get away from me. He even has a beauty mark. Liu has like even the beauty mark on his face. Like he's just the prettiest. I have a feeling the way that they've drawn him, I have a feeling I'm going to like Liu. I'm really excited. Yay! So I'm super excited about this story so far. Next week, we're going to be reading chapters 10, 11, and 12, which is super exciting. I can't wait to get through it. I hope you all are ready as well. But I'm curious to know your thoughts down below. What you thought about these additions to the novel versus the donghua and the easy mode and Liu and his seeming comparison to Luo Binghe. Interesting things are afoot, I feel, and we've only scratched the surface. We're only just a little bit, like a fourth of the way through. Maybe a little bit more, but we'll see. So I hope you all have a wonderful week. Please stay safe, take care, and yeah, I'll be back very soon with more of Scum Villain's self-saving system.